So when it's just time for the indirect bonding procedure, it's very similar to the attachment process with aligners. Basically, you are going to start with good isolation, and I really prefer to use the NOLA dry field system. If you have a patient that has a smaller tongue, you may use like the adult size lip retractors with the pediatric, kind of the red tongue retractor. So mixing and matching sometimes is helpful. Not everybody can use that, so sometimes you're using dry angles and things, but in an ideal world, what I prefer to do is a NOLA with the tongue retractor. I will etch the upper arch and rinse really thoroughly, prime the upper arch, and then seat the 3 trays on the upper arch. I'll do an initial after I seat the first tray. I'll tack cure that first tray for 5 seconds. I'll seat the second tray in the anterior and tack cure that tray for 5 seconds each. And then I'll tack cure the third tray for 5 seconds each. And then I will go around and in a continuous light, I'll shine from the buccal or from the gingival for 5 seconds per tooth and the occlusal for 5 seconds per tooth, or longer if you have a light that's not super powerful. And then I will peel off the upper trays, because you can peel, I like to start with the upper because I can peel off those trays really easily without taking out the tongue shield on the NOLA. And then I can do the same thing and do the lower arch, where I'll etch the whole lower arch, rinse really well, prime, and then seat the first tray, tack those first for 5 seconds each, seat the anterior, tack for 5 seconds, seat the other tray and tack for 5 seconds each, and then do the continuous cure. And then I can take out the NOLA before peeling out the lower anterior trays. If you start with the lower, it's really tough to take out those trays with the tongue shield in place. And it's tough, I find, to seat the lower and the upper trays because the patient has to open a little bit wider. So that's kind of my philosophy in terms of starting with the upper arch first. It's just, you can peel off those trays without having to take the tongue shield out. Now, if you're new to indirect bonding and you have a tough time kind of keeping a really dry field, another really good solution to try starting out as you're learning the system is just to start with 1 tray at a time and just etch those teeth, prime those teeth, and cure 1 tray and peel it off, and then do the next section, etch, prime, and then cure those, and kind of do that as your process. If you're really having a tough time with isolation, with this new tray, it's really nice because we have a non-stick element to it. So you can use a self-etch primer. So one thing you can try is doing a full arch etch, rinse really, really well, and then using a self-etch primer like the LPOP from 3M, and just do a 10-second scrub on each tooth, and then seat the tray, light cure that 1 tray, peel it off, move to the next one, do the LPOP for 10 seconds per tooth, seat that tray. And so it's a really good way to kind of get into 3D indirect bonding. Now that we have a non-stick tray, that LPOP is a really easy way to kind of take some of the technique out with the isolation, or if you have a really just patient that's really tough to isolate, it's a great way to kind of branch into it. So what I want to show you today is just on a lower model, just kind of a step-by-step best practices for indirect bonding with the light management, priming, and everything else. So I'm going to kind of walk you through that step really quick. So I'm not going to do the full etch and prime since we don't have to, or the full etch and rinse since we don't really have to do that on a 3D printed model. But you can kind of imagine I would etch all the way around with these teeth, and then you want to let that sit for at least 20 seconds, but no more than 60 seconds. So that's kind of your countdown. That's why you don't want to etch the top and bottom arches. So again, you want to let the etch sit for at least 20 seconds on each tooth, but no more than 60 seconds on each tooth. You want to make sure you do a really, really good rinse off. And so I rinse with high-speed suction, and then I like to blow air and water. And you want to make sure you dry that really, really well. And make sure that your air water syringe isn't blowing out water at all as you go through the drying out phase. And so also after you do the drying off phase, if any saliva touches the tooth surface, even after you've etched it, if you dry that area again, if saliva's touched it, it's contaminated. You have to re-etch. Even though it looks frosty white, the saliva or a lip having touched that will make the bond not adhere nearly as strong. And so that's why, isolation is so critical, is even if you see that frosty white, if you've had any saliva contact the tooth surface after you've done the etching step, it will affect the bond strength in a significant way. So you need to re-etch if you see that lip kind of touch the tooth surface. So anyway, I'm just gonna apply some primer to this model. And you just need to apply the primer where the bracket's gonna go. It used to matter a lot more with our bonding system. If you don't have a non-stick coating in your indirect bonding tray, you really wanna make sure you try and confine the primer to where the bracket is and not to where the bracket won't be, because indirect bonding trays have a tendency to stick to the teeth when they're 3D printed. And so it was one of the hardest things about peeling off the trays, is really a challenge with indirect bonding that are 3D printed trays. And so we'd light cure the primer and do all these extra steps, and we'd make sure that we were really kind of limiting our primer application to just where the brackets were gonna go. With the new trays that I'm kind of showing you today, there's a non-stick coating that we incorporate into the 3D printing trays, so we don't have to light cure the primer anymore. And we'd also don't really have to worry about where we put the primer anymore. And so those two things are really a nice improvement over old systems. Next step is to do a gentle air dry of the primer. And so before, we would tell people to sometimes skip this step because we didn't want to spread the primer all over the tooth surface. And again, that was more of a stickiness factor. But a light air dry is usually what we want. The goal here is to evaporate the solvent in the primer, not to spread the primer. And so we're just going for a gentle air dry. I don't have an air water syringe tip for this step, but a lot of times what I would do is I'd kind of hold the air water tip about a foot away from the patient's mouth and spray it that way. That way is always also a nice thing, that if you did have any moisture contamination in your air water tip, it wouldn't usually reach the tooth if it was 12 inches or more away from the patient's mouth. But you just want to do a gentle air evaporation of the solvent that's in the primer. It's not a spreading thing. So anyway, now we've got the primer applied. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out the tray. I'm going to set it on to the position. And then you want to make sure you close the lid again, because you don't want any ambient light touching that. And I like to start from the posterior typically, and I want to have my light tip putting pressure from the buccal, and I'm using my finger to apply pressure from the occlusal. And I like to hold my thumb on the next bracket forward, so I'm actually masking and covering the next bracket with my thumb. So it's protecting the light from curing the first molar as I'm curing and setting the second molar right now. And I'm just gonna let it go for 5 seconds. Make sure you turn off the light while you're moving it to the next tooth. And I'm gonna set my thumb to cover the 5 this time. And I'm just gonna set this for 5 seconds again. And the reason it's so important that you be situated before you move to the next one, and I don't have the light turned on before I move to the next one, is if you're polymerizing while your light tip is moving, or if you press that glue while it's moving, it's kind of like an alginate. If you take the impression while it's in its kind of setting phase, how it gets distorted. Same thing with this composite, is it's not going to be nearly as strong if you polymerize it and move the composite while it's setting. And so you want to be fully set. And so that's why I like to cover the next bracket kind of with my thumb and angle it kind of away from it. And now I've got that tray set, and those 4 brackets are tapped with 5-second cures. And so if you have a patient where, if you're learning this for the first time, then you might want to consider doing technique number 1, which is to then go back and now cure 5 seconds from the gingival, where you want to be right up as close as you can. And again, with this new tray, because the gingival third is exposed, It's really nice because we can get right close and personal with that composite, and it's gonna set really, really well from this tray. And you don't have to turn off the light because I'm not pushing the composite anymore, and we've got the initial cure already set. And then after that, we can go to the occlusal. For 5 seconds. And if there's any question, do an extra 5 seconds. You know, you can't overcure the composite at this stage. So if you're just learning, just do the 1 quadrant and you can peel it off if you want to, because that tray is a little bit warmer. If you're more of an experienced veteran, instead what I would have done is I would have seated this one, done the 5-second cure. I would have added the second tray and done a 5-second cure, added the third tray, done a 5-second cure, and then gone back around and done all of them. So I'm going to show you right now as if I had just done this one and just done the 5-second cure and moved on to tray number 2. So here we're going to add tray number 2. The nice thing about these trays too is you'll know that they're flush on the occlusal, so you know that they're seated correctly. If that tray from 1 to 2 is a smooth transition, you'll know that maybe you haven't seated it all the way if there's a little bit of a ledge or anything between those two. So I'm just gonna do the same thing I did before. I'm gonna cover with my finger the lateral incisor while I'm tacking the canine. I'm gonna move to the central. You can kind of see how I'm angling the light also more towards the canine than I am towards the central while I'm curing the lateral. But I'm pressing with that light tip gently against the bracket. So it just helps me make sure I'm seating that tray fully against the tooth. I'm not pushing really hard, it's just some gentle pressure. So I've just tacked now these for 5 seconds each, so they're set in position. And so if I'm more of an experienced bonding technician, then I would just move on to the last tray. And again, I'm gonna start in the distal, and I'm gonna cover the 6, or if you can't cover the 6, you can just angle the light away from the 6 and point to the distal more and cheat to the distal half of the tooth if you're not able to kind of mask it with your glove. So cheat to the distal and angle it more away from the 5, or if you can, like I said, actually kind of try and mask it with your finger and your glove. That's even better. And so now that I've got all of those cured, I'm gonna come back around, and without having to turn the light off between each tooth like I did for the tacking phase, I'm just gonna listen for the beep of the light and do 5-second cure from the gingival. And the closer you can get that light tip to the bracket, the better. Because distance, the further away you are, the less intense the light is and the less of a cure you're gonna get. So this gingival one is actually the best cure you're gonna get out of the whole indirect bonding process. And I'm gonna pretend that I didn't cure this one already from before, just so you can kind of see what the more experienced technique looks like, because I'm going to sweep all the way around. last is coming around from the occlusal. And then once I've got all of those cured, you just kind of roll from the lingual to buccal. And you can kind of see how, with that non-stick now, how easily these trays kind of just slip right off. Now we've got the brackets bonded. And the really nice thing with the non-stick coating now is these trays don't tear, and they can really easily be used for rebonding jigs and rebonding guides going forward. So that's kind of the indirect bonding kind of best tips, tricks. Again, one segment at a time is your learning. If you're just doing this for the first time, kind of just curing one step at a time, etching, priming. That way you can kind of just manage one part of the process at a time if you're worried about kind of isolation. If you're more experienced in indirect bonding, go ahead and etch the whole arch, prime the whole arch, seat one section, tack that section, just so you can at least make sure you get the bracket seated and no ambient lights curing it. Move to the next one, tack that section, tack the last section, and then go back and do the gingival cure and then the occlusal cure, peel off the trays. If you're having issues with bond strength, it could be your light intensity. You may want to go back and do an occlusal cure one more time. Most offices I find don't really find that step necessary, but anyway, hopefully this new tray design is huge of an improvement as you find as I have. Just so much less pressure, so much easier to bond cases now with new indirect bonding trays that we've come out with. I'm really excited to share this with you guys because it's made my bonding experience so much better.